It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but it is what comes out of the mouth that defiles. Then the disciples approached him and said to him, "Do you know that the Pharisees took offense when they heard what you said?" He answered, "Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind guides of the blind. And if one blind person guides another, both will fall into a pit." But Peter said to him, "Explain this parable to us." Then he said, "Are you still also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth enters the stomach and goes out into the sewer? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this is what defiles. For out of the heart come evil intentions, murder, adultery, fornication, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile." Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just then a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." He answered, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. The Gospel of the Lord. I am reminded this week as I was getting ready for the class that we're going to do on Wednesday of the number of times that I read things in my newsfeed from people claiming to be Christian who write things and say things which are so full of anger and arrogance and nastiness that I'm thinking to myself, I understand why Christianity has gotten a bad rap. Because if I were not part of the church and I read some of these things, I would not want to give Christianity a try. I would want to stay as far from anybody who called themselves a Christian as I possibly could. And sometimes it's really bad because I read these people writing this stuff, or I listen to them saying these things on TV, and I guess because they think they're going to sound holy and pompous or whatever, well, they do sound pompous, they want to use big theological Bible words. Words that we never use in our common everyday parlance, but sometimes we read in the Bible. Words like blasphemy and defile and things like all kinds of really horrible things like that, which really are only thrown out as kind of verbal hand grenades to kind of hurt or insult other people. I cringe whenever I hear those kinds of words, and I cringe not only because they're being thrown out there to kind of hurt other people, but I cringe because some of the time I'm reading this stuff and I'm going, these people using these words, they don't even know what they mean. They don't even actually understand the context, and so they're throwing these things out that they read in the Bible, but they're not really sure exactly what it's all about. So when I read today's gospel reading, the word defile jumped out at me, because that's another one of those big words that we don't usually use, and we don't usually hear except when we read a Bible verse like we read today. And Jesus is drawn into this conversation about what defiles because the Pharisees have really complained not so much about a hygiene issue, that the disciples haven't washed their hands and they might get sick or something like that, but because they didn't ritually wash their hands properly in order to not be defiled in the eyes of the law as far as they were concerned. So Jesus calls the crowds together and he starts having this conversation with them about what does and does not defile a person. But what is this defile stuff all about anyway? What does that word even mean? Well, one of the things you've got to realize is that sometimes in order to convey something, translators pick up a word that is very different from the actual word that's in the Bible, and they're trying to convey something, and defile is one of those words. It's a big sounding word of ritual uncleanness and things like that. But the word that Matthew actually uses, the one that he repeats Jesus saying, is simply the regular word for common. This whole conversation about defile is what makes you common. What makes you the same as everybody else? What is so ordinary and unremarkable that you're just like the rest of the world? And that conversation is always in juxtaposition to a conversation about what it means to be holy. And holy is another one of those big theological words that most of us don't really understand what it's all about. But the conversation about being holy dates from the time that the people of Israel entered the land, and God said to them, "Be holy as I am holy." And that did not mean walk around and act pompous and self-righteous and all the kind of stuff that so often people do. It meant holy was a word that meant special, unique, extraordinary. And really it was the call of God to say, "I am the one true God. I have loved you and saved you and given to you generously in an absolutely special, extraordinary way. Now you, by your words and your attitudes and your actions, show that to other people. Live as extraordinary people. If your words are words of love, you are living in a holy way because you're showing the extraordinary love of God. If your attitudes are one of love and acceptance, you are showing the extraordinary love and acceptance of God. If you act generously towards others, you are showing the extraordinary generosity of God. That's what it means to be holy. But if you don't do those things, if you do other kinds of things that everybody else does, then you're being common. You're being just like everybody else. And how will people actually know the extraordinary character and love of God if you're just going to behave, well, like everybody else, in a common way, just like the rest of the world? You know, I really don't need religious people to write stuff in my newsfeed, get on the TV, and behave in pompous, arrogant, small, petty little ways. Everybody else does that around me. That's not extraordinary, that's common. And that's really the conversation Jesus wanted to have with his disciples. He says, you know, looking holy because you've washed your hands properly or you've done some kind of ritual action, that's not what conveys the extraordinary character of God to the world. And in fact, you are called to be holy. That's what Jesus called his first disciples to do. That's what Jesus calls us to do. So the question really remains, what does it mean for us not to be common? For us to live as extraordinary, special people. To live in extraordinary, special ways. It probably does not mean, well, it certainly does not mean walking around looking pompous and trying to be holier than thou. And it probably doesn't mean that we have to behave in ways that are somehow going to make us famous or praised or anything, but it does mean that we're going to have to live in ways that are different from what so much of the world around us lives. And for us, maybe that means that Jesus is simply calling us to live lives that project the faith and confidence that God is with us, helping us, walking with us, and won't let us go no matter what's going on in the world. You know, when I pick up my newsfeed, I start looking at stuff. Stuff is really a mess in the world right now. I mean, it can be actually more of a mess. It may be more of a mess right now than it's ever been in the past. I remember watching I think it was a episode of Colbert Report the other day, where Stephen Colbert was talking about an interview that was done with Madeleine Albright, who's the former Secretary of State. As a child, she had to flee Czechoslovakia because the Nazi invasion happened, and she was Jewish, and she had to get out. And she was talking about how much more messed up the world seems now than it's ever been before. And Colbert says, listen, she says, she had to flee the Nazis as a child and go into exile, and this person thinks that that's a fond childhood memory compared to the way the world is right now. You know, things are really a mess. And it's normal, it's common to simply say, you know what, it's a mess, It's horrible. I'm going to duck and cover. I'm going to hide under the chair and hope that it all ends up in some other way. But you know what? I'm on my own. We're all on our own. That's often the way people react to stuff like that. What would it mean for us to be able to say, yeah, the world is a mess, and things are hard, and we need to do stuff, but finally in the end, God is going to be there with us. God's going to help us to endure it. God's going to help us to get through it, just like God helped us to get through every other horrible time in history. That kind of confidence, that kind of faith is not common. It can be the extraordinary thing that we need to project to the world. See, I think that's why Matthew put this story about the Canaanite woman right after the story about defilement. Jesus left the place where he was talking about defilement, and he went into an area of the region in which no Jews lived. And he encountered a person we would today call a Palestinian woman, who came up to him and said, my daughter is possessed by a demon, help me. And at first it sounds like Jesus is just going to ignore her and walk away, and she keeps up. She's absolutely confident that he's going to be able to help her, and that he will help her. And she doesn't give in, even when he says, well, I was only sent to the lost sheep of Israel, and this would be kind of like throwing the food to the dogs that was owned by the children. And she says, yeah, but even the dog get to eat the crumbs. And he goes, my gosh, that's extraordinary. That's an extraordinary kind of faith and confidence in God's love. That's uncommon. That's something I hardly ever see. That's what made this Canaanite woman holy. It wasn't that, she had some kind of moral thing that she was better than everybody else. It was that she had this tenacity of faith, that she was sure that God was not going to give up on her. What about us? Can we project that? Even at times in our lives where it may feel to us like we've been saying to God, God, help me out with this. I'm really in a bind here. Hello, are you even listening to me? Because it feels like I'm getting ignored. Or it feels like God's kind of going, well, I don't know. What would it mean for us to be able to convey the kind of sense of assurance that in God's own time and in God's own way, God's going to take care of us and help us and not abandon us? That's extraordinary. That's different from what people experience most of the time in the world. And that's the kind of holiness that Jesus is calling us to project. Sometimes for us too, the kind of being holy that Jesus wants us to be happens simply when we're willing to do small things to care and serve somebody else. Because it's really, really common and perfectly understandable when people have their own stuff to deal with, and they're really, really busy, and they're really, really tired, and they've got all of these real, actual needs, and all of us do, to say, I got to take care of my stuff. And I know you've got needs too, but I'm sorry, but I got to take care of me first. That's really common. What happens when we actually take the time to say, yeah, I am really busy, I do really have needs, I really do have to deal with my stuff, but you know what, I'm going to take some time and some energy and some effort and actually help somebody else out. Whether it's as simple as bringing in school supplies for kids who need them, or calling up a neighbor to see how they're doing, or standing with somebody who really needs you to stand there at that particular moment. Sometimes those acts are extraordinary in the lives of others because it's not common to see that happen. When those things happen, when we do those things, we become the kind of holy, extraordinary people Jesus is calling us to be. And that often has a whole lot more impact than anything that comes out of our mouths. There's a story that was told from about the 2nd, 3rd century during the time of fairly intense persecution of Christians. There were a number of plagues that went through Rome, and they were common, and they scared people as much as Ebola scares us now. They were very contagious, and people just fled Rome. And one of these plagues, the story is told that the Christians didn't flee Rome. They were like the only group that really didn't just run away. And the reason they didn't run away was not because they thought the plague was fun or because they wanted to die and be martyred or some kind of silliness like that. The reason they wouldn't is because to run away, like everybody else, they would have had to abandon their sick relatives and friends, and they wouldn't do it. And it was that act that made a lot of the pagans look at them and go, what is it about these people? That's different. That's extraordinary. It wasn't that somehow Christians were more moral than other people or they had better theology than other people. It was that in that act of caring for one another, they showed the extraordinary love and character of God, and that's what made people sit up and take notice. That's the kind of holy and uncommon that Jesus calls us to. And maybe for us too, being uncommon, being holy in the way that Jesus wants us to be holy, and this is sort of ironic, maybe that comes through by using common words. Because most of us kind of understand that, throwing out words to people like blasphemy and defilement and stuff like that, that's bad. But a lot of times when we feel like, okay, I'm supposed to share my faith, I'm supposed to tell people about God in my life, a lot of times we think we got to come up with the big theological words. We got to come up with the right answer that somehow we think we maybe could kind of sort of remember from Sunday school or confirmation class or something. And yet often, it's the ordinary, common words. But when you put your faith and your experience of God into your own words and you tell somebody about it, it's that has the biggest impact. It's that ends up having an extraordinary experience for people. So, telling people about eschatology and salvation and stuff like that, their eyes are going to glaze over and stuff. But if you say, I was in a tough time in my life, but I felt God's presence, and I felt God walking with me and lifting me up. Or, I know things have been tough and you're wondering where God is, but I don't know. Maybe I'm the person God sent to help you out. Simple words like that sometimes convey the love and the presence and the power of God. Well, really the extraordinary character of a God who's actually present with us in our own world. Because that's not what people think. They think God's out there someplace. If we can actually talk about God being present with us and being present through us for other people, just in regular common words, sometimes that actually becomes extraordinary in the lives of others. And we show the extraordinary character of God. Finally, in the end, Jesus actually is calling his disciples, back then and right now, to be holy people. But when he calls us to be holy, he doesn't call us to use big words or to be pompous or to walk around and show how kind of cool we are. Instead, he calls us to be people who simply through our words and our deeds and our attitudes towards others convey the extraordinary power and presence of God in our lives. And often, when we're open to living in some of those ordinary, but actually extraordinary ways, God's love shines through us, and God transforms us also into people who really are holy in the way that Jesus wants us.